Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 5, Chapter 14, The First Masurian Lakes. The double battles of the 8th German Army under Hindenburg and Ludendorff against the two superior armies of Samsonov and Rennenkampf are not only a military classic, but an epitome of the art of war. One of our finest officers, General Ironside, has devoted an entire volume to the first 30 days in East Prussia, which certainly no military student should neglect. Here our pages must be confined to a general account of the operations, placed in their relation to the whole European scene. By the night of September 1, the victors of Tannenberg were already turning to their new task, nor was there the slightest doubt what the task should be. Says Hoffmann laconically, Samsonov's army had been practically destroyed. Of his 5.5 corps, 3.5 were either dead or prisoners. The remaining about 1.5 corps had to be sent back into the neighborhood of Warsaw for reformation. Our hands were free to act against Rennenkampf. With fierce and confident hope the Germans made their plans. They were freed now from the anxieties of a converging attack by superior forces. Their problem was simplified. Many unknown factors had disappeared. They had tested the quality of their troops and organization in every kind of fighting against their foe. They knew that whether in attack or defense, he was no match for them. However, the two fresh army corps, Guard Reserve and the 9th, so improvidently withdrawn from the German right wing in France, had arrived in East Prussia. Hindenburg and Ludendorff disposed of 17 divisions, the original 9, the 4 auxiliary, and the 4 from France. This powerful force, braced by success, was entitled to feel itself superior to Rennenkampf's army, whether that comprised 20 or 24 divisions. Nor was the method of setting about him far to seek. He must be attacked on his front from the sea to the lakes. While thus gripped, his flank must be turned and, if possible, his retreat cut off by a right-handed northward movement through the line of the lakes. Here the immense strategic advantage of this line of water, marsh, and German fortifications presents itself. The small fortress of Lötzen stood in the gap between the northern and southern lakes. Its resolute commander had made no answer to a Russian summons to surrender, but to fire upon, wound, and capture the officer and trumpeter sent upon that audacious mission. The Russians, having overlooked in their plans for the invasion of East Prussia the need of a few heavy howitzers to reduce Lötzen, could do nothing against its permanent defences. Lötzen was therefore a bridgehead and a fatal sally-port through which the flank and communications of Rennenkampf's army could be assailed. The gap, only a mile wide, was traversed by a good military road and by the railway line to Lück and beyond the Russian frontier. South of Lötzen the chain of lakes continued for another 30 miles to Johannesburg, with a number of gaps between them defended by fieldworks, none of which had passed out of German hands during the crisis of Samsonov's invasion. If the Germans could advance in force through the Lötzen and the other gaps between the lakes, while Rennenkampf was held to his positions by a frontal attack, the capture or destruction of his entire army was a reasonable expectation. The point for decision was not the method, but the relative strength to be assigned to the frontal and to the turning movements. It must be remembered that the turning movement, as it progressed, would expose first its right shoulder and later on its rear to the attack of any Russian forces in Warsaw or along the Narew. The remains of Samsonov's army were not perhaps immediately formidable, but the Germans could not know what other resources the Russian Empire might not have marshaled in their great railway center of Warsaw or behind their fortified river line. It would be necessary to ward off or delay such interventions until Rennenkampf was beaten. The shorter and sharper the operation, the less would be the risk. Hindenburg and Ludendorff decided to send 8 divisions against Rennenkampf's front. To provide 5 together with the 2 cavalry divisions for the turning movement through the gaps, and to use the remaining 3 to ward off the Russians from the south. There were, and are still, 2 opinions upon this distribution. François, to whom the leading role in the turning movement was confided, naturally and perhaps rightly pressed for an additional corps. But Hoffmann points out that Hindenburg and Ludendorff were not entitled to ignore the possibility that Rennenkampf himself might take the offensive with his great mass against any Germans on his front, and would in such circumstances have a superiority of more than 2 to 1. Thus, then, it was settled. The 20th, 11th, 1st Reserve and Guard Reserve Corps moved against Rennenkampf's front. The 1st and 17th Corps and the 3rd Reserve Division, with the cavalry, were assigned to the envelopment. It took 4 days to regroup the German forces in accordance with these orders, and on September 5 their general advance began. What meanwhile of Rennenkampf and his Russians? And what of Zielinski? Up till August 27, Zielinski still had a picture of his Second Army advancing northwards, but he felt uneasily that it required help from Rennenkampf. Late that day he had wired to him that German troops were being transferred from Rennenkampf's front by rail and were strongly attacking Samsonov. "Cooperate," he said, "with the Second Army by moving your left flank as far as possible towards him." But Zielinski's order displayed no disquietude about the Second Army, and he seemed content with Rennenkampf's movements of 3 corps to moderate marches to the southwest. In the evening of the 29th at 7 p.m. a more urgent order arrived. In view of the heavy fighting in the Second Army, the Commander-in-Chief orders you to move 2 corps to its support. The cavalry should be sent forward to Allenstein. And at 11 p.m., the Second Army has withdrawn. Certainly no overstatement. Therefore the Commander-in-Chief orders the forward movement of the 2 corps to cease. And on the 30th, General Samsonov has suffered a complete defeat, and the enemy has now full liberty to turn against you. You must take every measure to interrupt the railway lines by which the enemy may move troops against you. Be careful that the enemy does not take measures against you through Lötzen. Even now, however, the commander of the Northwest Front had not abandoned the idea of blockading Königsberg, and on September 1 his staff were still forming a reserve corps for this purpose. The reaction of Tannenberg upon Zielinski and Rennenkampf was the same. Both expected that the Second Russian Army would now have to bear the full weight of the German attack. Rennenkampf decided to withdraw all his forces and concentrate on the general line of Insterburg, and on September 2 he issued orders which placed the bulk of his army in an entrenched position, with the sea on one flank and the lakes on the other. The next 3 days were occupied in fortifying this line, which, but for the Lötzen Gap and turning movements farther to the south, was secure. Acutely sensitive of the Lötzen danger, he assigned an entire corps to watch its exits. Zielinski approved these arrangements. He ordered his First Army to maintain its present position at all costs against superior forces of the enemy which may be brought against it. His Second Army, which he was able to reinforce by the 22nd, the 3rd Siberian and the 1st Turkestan Corps, a new army in themselves, was to cover the approaches to the lower Narev in such a way as to strengthen, though somewhat remotely, the very turning movement which the Germans had designed. But on September 4, the 2.5 German divisions, which under von der Goltz were to ward off Russian interventions from the southward, advanced on Mlava and seized the town. Zielinski thereupon leapt to the conclusion that the Germans, instead of throwing their weight against Rennenkampf, were going to strike at Warsaw, and he now became anxious for Rennenkampf to take the offensive. He developed a grandiose scheme for another great concentric offensive in which his First Army, the remains of the Second, and the 3 new corps were to take part. This offensive was to begin on September 14. Such were the orders of General Zielinski on the night of September 4. They dealt largely in phantom armies and with an imaginary situation. They were brushed aside by reality. During the 5th, 6th, and 7th, the 4 German corps, constituting the main attack upon Rennenkampf, advanced by easy marches and drew up before the Insterburg entrenchments. They did not begin their battle until the 9th. Meanwhile, the turning movement had made great progress. François, with 3 divisions and a cavalry brigade, drove weak Russian forces out of Biala on September 7, and at dawn the next day took the town of Aris, which, like Biala, was held only by 6 Russian battalions and a few batteries of artillery. The 2 German divisions employed, fighting upon their own peacetime training ground, knowing every yard, quickly routed these detachments. And thereupon François turned due north with his own First Corps towards Rennenkampf's communications. He sent his 3rd Division to capture Luck, in order still further to widen the envelopment. At the same time, Mackensen and the 17th Corps had marched through the Lötzen Gap and deployed beyond it. Here they encountered the Russian 2nd Corps drawn up to receive them, and a serious engagement began. During the 8th, the Russians stopped the gap. They were strongly entrenched between various lakes, and no local means could be found of turning their flanks. The 2 German cavalry divisions, which were to have passed the gap after the 17th Corps, found themselves hopelessly blocked by its transport. 2 additional Russian divisions arrived during the day, and when darkness fell, the Russian front was everywhere secure. September 9 was a day of general battle. Hindenburg with 4 corps attacked the Insterburg line. The 17th Corps strove to get its shoulder through the Lötzen Gap. The Russians withstood them all stubbornly. The deep trenches they had now constructed gave them protection from the German artillery. They were not blown out of them, as Samsonov's left flank guard had been from its shallow ditches on the morrow of Tannenberg. Enough Russians were left alive after the bombardments to arrest the infantry attacks, and the Germans had not the ammunition for the pulverization customary upon the Western Front. Indeed, the night of the 9th closed with the German forces everywhere engaged and the Russian front everywhere intact. But nothing could stand against the turning movement from the south. François had played a part on this day as decisively and brilliantly successful as at Tannenberg. At daybreak at 3:30 a.m. on the 9th, his 2 indefatigable divisions broke upon the left and rear of the Russians, resisting the 17th Corps, and rolled, crumpled, and scooped them up. The whole Russian line opposite the Lötzen Gap broke into confusion. The best part of 4 divisions, hard fought in front, turned in flank and attacked in rear, were routed and fled the field, leaving 60 guns, 5,000 prisoners, and all their impedimenta in François's hands. Hard indeed, cruel and unfair are those malignant turns of war by which events far beyond their view and utterly outside their control rob brave soldiers of all the fruits of their sacrifices and their success. General Ironside has calculated that François's 2 divisions had covered 77 miles in 4 days, with deployments and fighting on 2 of them. They therefore deserved at least some of the rewards which fell into their hands. During these events, François's 3rd Division had in a combat of equal strength defeated the Russians in Luck. The flank of Rennenkampf's left army was now turned, and 2 German corps with 2 cavalry divisions had only to march steadily northward through Gumbinen upon Stallupönen or Wilkowiski to cut off the retreat. Thus ended for the day the fierce and bloody fighting in East Prussia of September 9. But now Rennenkampf acted with desperate vigor. Without troubling to inform Zieliński, he resolved to fly while time remained. He fled and flew. No sooner had the news of the disaster to his troops in front of the Lötzen Gap reached his headquarters than he issued orders for the immediate general retreat of his whole army, covered by the counterattack of 2 divisions. It was, says General Ironside, most gallantly executed by the 40th Division of the 4th and the 26th Division of the 2nd Corps. It was perfectly successful in its purpose. This counterattack occupied September 10. The German 20th Corps was brought to a complete standstill with surprising losses. It staggered before the blow. It was 48 hours before it could set itself again in motion. Russian military annals should not forget this feat of arms. Under its audacious protection, Rennenkampf and the Russian First Army set out for home. Fast they went, and faster still. Due east, back again along the track they had covered 3 weeks before in such overweening hope. Every risk was run in order to escape. Divisions marched parallel on either side of a single road, occupied by interminable columns of transport. They marched all night, they marched all day, and all the next night, and on still. The main bulk of the army actually covered 55 miles in 50 hours, while still remaining in the ranks. On still they marched or stumbled and staggered away from the foe, whose art was more terrible even than his flaming sword. But none of this wise promptitude and speed would have availed the Russian army if François and Mackensen had been allowed to march in their original direction. They must have cut in upon the line of retreat between Gumbinen and Wilkowiski, and broken everything into chaos. Speed and flight was vital, but by itself it would not have gained salvation. It was the counterattack of the 2 brave divisions, nameless men and commanders unnoticed by history, who saved the army. They left their mark upon the German 20th Corps. They made a more important impression upon Ludendorff's mind. This great soldier and genius, in whom so many fine qualities were embodied, suffered from the very liveliness of his own perceptions. Dwelling at the heart of the plan, receiving and reacting to all the events and news, true or false, which flowed in from minute to minute, Ludendorff sustained a sinister impression from the Russian counterattack. Instead of letting Mackensen and François swoop out northeastward, he pulled his right hand in for close participation in the battle which he expected to develop around Darkhemen on the 10th. Thus, as the 10th wore on after the sun had climbed high in the heavens, and the long columns of Mackensen and François were streaming northwards to deploy upon the tactical flank of the Russian Insterburg position, it became obvious they were clutching only at the skirts of a Russian retreat, or even indeed at the vacant air. By the night of the 10th, the chance of interception had vanished. Nothing remained but a stern chase, and in this the Russians had even a greater incentive to speed than their ravening pursuers. After the 13th, the German pursuit slackened, and the enormous mass of Russian troops and vehicles, nearly choked by a block in Stallupönen, streamed eastward and homeward by every route, track, and footpath. The last fighting was at Wilkowiski. Here the Russian rearguard had to stand at bay to gain a few more hours for the masses in rear to liquidate themselves. Rennenkampf decided, perhaps rightly, that nothing should be done to extricate the rearguard. They fought to the end and were destroyed, but with a loss of 45,000 prisoners, about 200 guns and perhaps 100,000 casualties, Rennenkampf's army escaped to the Niemen from the steel jaws which had already devoured Samsonov. For nearly a week Zielinski had been issuing orders to the void. The Germans, who read on the wireless with almost hourly punctuality his mental excursions, were baffled by the flood of secret matters imparted to them. It was impossible for them to learn any more from the orders of the Russian High Command, even when laid in text before them, since these had now ceased to have any contact with reality. It sounds magnificent to have the command of the Russian Northwest Front, to poise there high at the summit, moving 1,000,000 men and the pieces of a gigantic chessboard. But what mental torture could exceed the measure meted out to Zielinski as he sat each day during this fatal month at his desk in Bialystok? His two army commanders were famous national warriors with wide freedom of action. The orders which he could rightly issue were broad and few and far between. The information which reached him was voluminous when little was happening, and scanty or nil when supreme events were in progress. Zielinski had given his lifetime to the military service and was esteemed a soldier of the highest professional skill. In 30 days this wonderful chance of his had flared up in utter catastrophe. There he sat at the same desk in the same room with the same ceremony and decorum around him, a failure, a byword in history, a cause of his country's undoing, all because he had sent telegrams from time to time, as was his duty, and even had belied these telegrams. There were the maps, there were the telegrams, there was the quiet room, there was the horrible disaster. And this was the glamour of a high command, almost the highest in modern war. This was what was supposed to equal the opportunities and experiences of the great commanders of history. What a swindle, what a mockery! They at least rode their horses in the battle smoke and shared the perils of the soldiers they actually led. But here all around were only the maps and the jiggling flags, the counterfoils of telegrams, all read by the enemy, and incoming disconnected tidings of ruin, and glum staff officers slouching in with more. The military critics have glared upon Zielinski's various orders, but few of them, with their present-day knowledge of the values and proportions of the campaign in East Prussia, would care to have such opportunities offered to them. At the end he was furious with Rennenkampf. Just as Samsonov during the 4 days of his agony had ceased to hold the slightest communication with his chief, so Rennenkampf, from the hour when he scuttled with such commendable promptitude and fortunate effrontery from the Insterburg line, had not bothered about anything except getting his army away, unless indeed it be getting his own headquarters away. For these last moved very rapidly. They changed repeatedly, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day, until the crisis had passed, and thereafter he betook himself to Kovno, far from the maddening crowd. Zielinski, neglected and marooned, but still accountable, poured out his resentment to the Grand Duke and the Stavka. General Rennenkampf has thought more about the safety of his staff than of directing the movements of his army, which he has not in actual fact commanded for several days. He reports that he is moving to Wilkowiski and that he is withdrawing the 3rd and 26th Corps eastward, leaving the remaining corps of his army to their fate. His staff has gone with him. The behavior of the army commander had made all direction of operations impossible. He has altered the position of his headquarters 4 times in the last 24 hours, each time completely breaking off communication. The Stavka, which had at any rate the victory of Lemberg to live upon, received these protestations coolly. They replied that, It was quite in the nature of General Rennenkampf to wish to direct his troops personally, and suggested that Zieliński should try to get in touch with him at Wilkowiski. He was already in Kovno. On September 17, the day Rennenkampf's rearguard was sacrificed at Wilkowiski, Zieliński was relieved of his command, and General Ruski from the successful Galician theatre was placed in charge of the northwest front. He rallied the First Army in front of the Niemen River. Says Hoffmann in his diaries, Well, up till now, with inferior numbers, we have defeated about 15 Russian army corps and 8 cavalry divisions, and we are not finished yet. Now for it once again." Meanwhile, what have been the fortunes of the Austro-Hungarian Empire? General Konrad von Hötzendorf had fought the Battle of Lemberg to the last ounce, the last inch and the last minute which his armies could sustain. When on September 11 he was forced to give the hateful signal to retreat, there was very little fighting power left. The retreat was terrible. Auffenberg's army, in escaping from the Russian claws, had to traverse and impine upon a large part of the communications of the Third Austrian Army. Transport vehicles of every kind marched 4 abreast upon roads also encumbered with civilian refugees. Extraordinary rains pretty generally follow great battles, and the infantry plodded across sopping fields. The guns drove their way somehow through the traffic blocks. Few and devoted were the soldiers of the rearguards. Many were the alarms and panics which the dreaded cry, "Kosaken kommen," started. Vast, interminable processions of misery, physical suffering of every kind, weariness, grief for friends and comrades dead, grief for battles lost beyond recall, trailed across the landscape. These rivers of the inferno flowed sluggishly, but they flowed ceaselessly. They flowed homewards. They flowed faster than the Russians could follow. The power of the modern rifle, of a few machine guns, of a battery or 2 of field artillery to delay the pursuer, to make him await his artillery, nay, to kill him if he is impatient, may perhaps for the first time have been inculcated in the mind of the imperial and royal armies. At any rate, they toiled on. They struggled on. But they continued to get away from the fire of the foe and the ghastly battles and the hopeless sense of being overpowered. Przemysl was a first-class fortress. A wide circle of detached forts guarded the military area and the many roads, each crawling with humanity and wagons, which converged upon it. Inextricable congestion ensued. Przemysl itself became for some days a solid block of guns and transport. On the roads leading to it, all wheels presently ceased to turn. Meanwhile, the Russian cannon growled behind, and rifle shots as well as shells smote the paralyzed columns. In the end there was no recourse but to unyoke the horses and leave miles of laden transport 4 abreast to be the poor but not unwelcome price of the victors. Still, Przemysl gave some relief. An army corps was left to hold the fortress besides its own special troops. The rearguards disappeared within the spacious perimeter. The cannon of the forts fired upon the Russians, and they had to halt or go a long way round. But the retreat continued. When the San was reached on the 16th, the state of the armies was such that Konrad realized the impossibility of turning there. He ordered the retreat to proceed to the Dunajec, which flows into the Vistula more than 130 miles west of Lemberg. Day and night, reads the Austrian official account, behind a gigantic train of transport wagons marched the infantry, with bowed heads, yet undiscouraged. The artillery, sinking in up to their axles in the morass of the roads, worked their way forward. The cavalry regiments, like horsemen of the apocalypse, in molten confusion, made their way on. their presence often betrayed from afar by the penetrating smell given off by the festering galls of hundreds of led horses. After the passage of the sun, the Russians' pursuit, for reasons which will presently appear, slackened, and by September 26 Konrad found it possible to form a front before reaching the Dunajec stream. Of the 900,000 Austro-Hungarian troops who had taken the field in August in Galicia 6 weeks before, considerably less than 2/3 had repassed the San. Says the Austrian official account, the Russians did not exaggerate when they claimed in their message of victory that the enemy had lost 250,000 dead and wounded and 100,000 taken prisoners. But this was not the worst of the injury to the military power of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The imperial and royal army was composed like no army in the world. Mutual jealousies, the arrogance of the Hungarians, the pan-Slav ambitions of the Czechs, Croats, and Slovenes, the questionable sympathies of the Tyrolese, created a doubtful loyalty in at least one man in 4. The personnel of the army was 20% German, 23% Magyar, 17% Czechoslovak, 11% Serb, Croat, and Slovenes, 8% Polish, 8% Ukrainian, 7% Romanian, and 1% Italian. In order to prevent collective disaffection, a considerable mixture of races had been arranged in many units. But the pre-war cadres of the army contained about 75% of officers of German race, and this proportion was followed very largely in the permanent staff of under-officers and sergeants. There were 80 words of command in German, which affected the drill and control of the whole heterogeneous mass. Outside the German framework, many officers did not even know these. It was this permanent Teutonic staff and structure that held the whole army together. These courageous, resolute professionals had exposed themselves with ardor. Their losses had been out of all proportion to those of the rank and file. More than half had perished. They were irreplaceable. Never again could the great masses of brave and docile manhood, which the dual monarchy could still command, be guided by the Teutonic element. The need of employing very large numbers of new officers of Czech, Romanian, or Croat nationality offered positions of authority to many who hated the Teutonic race and cared nothing for the House of Habsburg. This mutilation of the Austro-Hungarian army in the terrible battles of 2 nations, called Lemberg, ranks with the turn at the Marne as the most important and irrevocable result of the war in 1914. It is the supreme condemnation of Konrad's narrow military creed, tense, sincere, lion-hearted as it was. His finest qualities were the cause of his country's undoing. Of all the campaigns that were ever fought, the Austro-Hungarian campaign in Galicia required most of all the use of time. Of all the armies that have ever existed since Hannibal marched into Italy, the Austro-Hungarian army needed the most careful handling. Konrad broke their hearts and used them up in 3 weeks. Had he sat in the seat of Moltke with the Schlieffen Plan to execute and the German armies to direct, he might today be the outstanding captain of history books, different from those which will now be printed.